It's December 2025 and I'm back in Germany for another weekend exploring another city and its Christmas market. This time, the capital of a once powerful and now former state of Hesse Kassel. Located around 70 kilometres northwest of the geographic centre of modern-day Germany, the city of Kassel has not always been so close to the heart of the country. With strong links to the neighbouring state of Thuringia, the city suffered during the years of division as it found itself at the eastern edge of the Bundesrepublik, whilst its traditional links were now across an international and very iron border. The third largest city in the modern state of Hessen, behind Frankfurt and state capital Wiesbaden, but at the opposite end of the state from those two cities, Kassel sits by itself as the most important city in northern Hesse and the wider local region. Excavations carried out in the old market square in 2007 uncovered remains of the Neolithic settlement close to the Fulda River and the ridge that forms the upper part of the modern town away from the river's edge. The first mention of Kassel is in court documents from 913. At the time, King Conrad I, the King of East Francia, issued documents from Chasselas, a fortified royal court on the Fulda River. By the middle of the 12th century, the former royal court had developed into the residence of the Counts of Hesse. Kassel received its own charter sometime before 1189, though the original charter was lost. The town's rights were reaffirmed in 1239. In 1277, the city became the main residence of the Landgraves of Hesse after the separation of Hesse from Thuringia, with the first Landgrave, Henry I, setting up his court in the former royal court, whilst also developing the lower, new town of the city with a focus on building religious institutions. In 1330, Landgrave Henry II expanded the city to accommodate the growing population of Kassel, and less than 60 years later, the previously independent towns of Altstadt, Old Town, Neustadt, New Town, and Freiheit, Freedom, were merged into a single municipality. The city was subject to a number of unsuccessful military attacks and sieges during the 14th century, most notably in 1385 by the troops of Balthasar of Thuringia. In 1458, following the death of Landgrave Ludwig I, Hesse was divided due to inheritance disputes. Ludwig Jr., the eldest son, received Lower Hesse, centred around Kassel, and his second son, Heinrich, received Upper Hesse, centred around Marburg. Keen to get on with stamping his mark on his new dominion, Ludwig II had the existing royal court demolished and a new castle built on the site in 1466. Just over a century later, with the death of Philip of Hesse in 1567, a recombined Hesse was again subdivided into 4 new landgraves: Hesse-Marburg, Hesse-Rheinfels, Hesse-Darmstadt, and Hesse-Kassel. Philip had played an important role in the Reformation in the Holy Roman Empire states, and Hesse-Kassel would go on to become a centre of Calvinist Protestantism, with strong fortifications built to protect the Protestant stronghold against Catholic enemies from surrounding states. In 1685, Kassel became a refuge for 1,700 Huguenots who were fleeing persecution. Towards the end of the 18th century, Hesse-Kassel became infamous for selling mercenaries to the British Crown to help suppress the American Revolution, with the funds raised financing the construction of palaces and the opulent lifestyle of the Landgrave, with the Wilhelmshöhe palace constructed on high grounds to the west of the city centre around this time. In 1803, the Landgraviate was elevated to a principality and the Landgrave to a Prince-Elector, one of the most senior roles in the Holy Roman Empire, though that temporarily changed between 1807 and 1813 when Napoleon annexed Hesse-Kassel and turned it into the capital of the Kingdom of Westphalia under the rule of his brother Jerome. Kassel backed Austria in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 in an attempt to gain supremacy within the German Confederation. Prussia won the war and promptly merged Hesse-Kassel with Nassau and Frankfurt to create the Prussian province of Hesse-Nassau. Though Kassel remained the capital of the new province, but now under the rule of Prussia, it ceased to be a princely residence. Instead, the city developed into a major industrial centre as well as an important railway junction and home to the largest railway locomotive manufacturer in Germany, Henschel & Son. This is a role the city continues to have to today, with, through various mergers, acquisitions, sales and takeovers, the Henschel business is now part of Alstom, with the Kassel factory still being one of the world's largest manufacturers of locomotives. From 1899 to his abdication in 1918, the Wilhelmshöhe Palace became the summer residence of Kaiser Wilhelm II. During World War II, the city became the headquarters of the Kreis 9, the military district responsible for both Hesse and Thuringia, charged with the organisation and handling of reinforcements and resupplying local military units. The city also housed a subcamp of a Dachau concentration camp to provide forced labour at the Henschel facilities, which by then were focusing on producing tanks. Kassel suffered some of the most severe and continuous bombing by Allied forces during the war, with raids taking place from February 1942 until March 1945. In the deadliest raid on the 22nd to 23rd of October 1943, around 150,000 inhabitants were made homeless, and somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people were killed. By the end of the war, 90% of the downtown area had been destroyed, not helped by 4 days of heavy house-to-house fighting between US soldiers and German panzer divisions from the 1st to the 4th of April 1945, before the US were able to secure control of the city. Post-war, the city found itself in the US sector of control and eventually West Germany, but due to the level of damage, most of the ancient buildings in the city were not restored, with much of the city centre being completely rebuilt in modern style. The city, along with Bonn, Frankfurt and Stuttgart, put itself forward for the competition to become home to the West German government, but was eliminated in the first round of voting, which Bonn went on to win. From the 1960s through to the late 1980s, the city suffered from labour shortages as it found itself at the eastern edge of the Bundesrepublik and cut off from the labour force of Thuringia over the border in the Deutsche Demokratische Republik. The city's manufacturing base went into protracted decline. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, the city set about reviving itself, given its now key location almost at the centre of the country, becoming a major hub for both road and rail transport. The country's first high-speed railway line from Hanover to Würzburg passed through the Wilhelmshöhe district of the city, so a new large station was built here to serve both local and ICE trains, with the existing Kassel Hauptbahnhof reduced to a regional station. The Wilhelmshöhe area got a further upgrade in 2000 after it was recognised as a thermal brine spa area and officially became Bad Wilhelmshöhe. Today, the city of Kassel has a population of around 200,000 and still has substantial manufacturing base, including military equipment, railway vehicles and green energy. With no sign of a royal palace today, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was one of the casualties of the post-war rebuild of the city, but in fact the Landgrave's Palace, and the once palace for King of Westphalia, was destroyed in a fire in 1811, whilst Jerome Bonaparte was king and never restored. The Prussians built a regional government building in the location, which was destroyed in World War II, with the replacement building becoming the offices of the regional government. That doesn't mean there's no presence of the Landgrave's opulence in the city centre. More on Schloss Wilhelmshöhe later. In the city centre itself, the Karlsaue Park was started by Landgrave Karl in 1680 as a Baroque pleasure garden for himself, with the Orangerie being added between 1701 and 1711. Modelled on French examples, the Baroque building was added to complement the Baroque garden. The main building is 139.4 metres long and was designed as a low structure with a taller 2-storey central section and at the ends 2 taller still 3-storey pavilions. The Orangerie is aligned the main axis for Karlsaue Park to keep the symmetry of the Baroque structures, though only the main palace and the western pavilion were completed within Karl's lifetime, the latter being finished in 1722. It took until 1765 for the eastern pavilion to be completed. The palace ended up getting knocked about quite a bit, with botched repairs in the 1830s causing most of the stucco work and interior paintings to be lost. However, the greatest damage wasn't at the hands of incompetent plasterers, but of the bombs of the RAF, who reduced the Orangerie to ruins in an air raid on Kassel on the 22nd of October 1943. The site remained as ruins long after the war, only finally being restored in 1981. During the time of the Landgraves, the long galleries served as the perfect place to hold banquets, as well as for overwintering of potted plants that were displayed in the Orangerie garden during the summer. The corner pavilions became summer residence for the Landgraves family. That changed with the arrival of the Kingdom of Westphalia, with the buildings being used as a military hospital and storehouses. Today, the main building is home to the largest planetarium in Hesse. The Karlsaue Park, officially the Staatspark Karlsaue or Karlsaue State Park, covers an area of 1.5 square kilometres and is today fully open for public to explore. Almost totally flat, the park occupies the area below the ridge that the city centre occupies, running up to the banks of the Fulda River. And if that sounds like it might be the river's floodplain, you'd be right. Up until the construction of the park in the 16th century, this area is part of an inland delta, surrounded on both sides by branches of the Fulda. The water that previously flowed around the land has been canalised and is used to help feed the multiple water features and lakes that occupy the site. The first park in the area was laid out as early as 1568 by Landgrave William IV, with a Renaissance garden laid out at the very tip of the delta area between the two branches of the Fulda, close to where the Orangerie would eventually be built. William's successor, Landgrave Moritz, expanded the park and it became known for a short while as the Moritzau. However, the bulk of the work and layout of the modern park dates from the reign of Landgrave Karl, originally having the park set out in a strict geometric design typical of the Baroque era. Work commenced in 1680, but the Baroque design was abandoned at the end of the 18th century as Baroque fell out of fashion and parts of the garden were redesigned in the then fashionable English landscape garden style. Whilst the latter works were in a different style, it's still very easy to see the original Baroque layout of the gardens, though by Swan Island and its neoclassical temple the changes to the park become more visible. Directly behind Swan Island is the Blumeninsel Siebenbergen, or Flower Island Siebenbergen, one of the first creations of a redesigned park in the 18th century, home to rare plants that were cultivated on the island itself. The Staatsmuseum Kassel deals with the history of the city and can trace its roots back to the mid-1970s, though there have been repeated attempts to create a city museum since at least the 19th century. Collections had been built during this time, but were dispersed among different exhibitions at various locations throughout the city. Over the decades, as exhibitions closed, the artefacts were put into storage at the Hessian State Museum, but by the 1970s its storage facilities were reaching capacity and only a small part of the collection of the city-related material could ever be put on display at any one time. At a meeting of the City Council in July 1978, it was agreed to establish a city museum somewhere in the city centre to house not only the exhibits in storage, but also items to be donated by members of the public to the new museum. In early 1979, it was decided that the listed, but almost completely destroyed, Karl's Hospital should be the venue for the museum. The building had been gutted by bombing during the war, with only the external walls still standing, which allowed, within the footprint of the building, to create a dedicated museum space without the need to convert an existing building. In the interim, a temporary museum administration was set up in the 19th century cultural centre at Ständerplatz. However, planning works dragged on with discussions as to whether the Karl's Hospital was the right location or not. By 1982, the date the museum was originally supposed to have opened by, construction work had still not started. By 1986, the decision was made to keep the museum in the Ständerplatz building and instead move out other activities and library services from the building to increase the space available to the museum. Between September 2001 and May 2002, the museum was closed for reconstruction works, and the museum closed again between 2010 and 2016 for further reconstruction, as well as expansion with the addition of a large tower to the rear of the building to significantly increase exhibition space. However, at the time of visiting, further works were underway on the middle floor of the museum to redesign the layout of the 20th century history gallery, so at the time of visiting, the museum was only showing the history of the city from its founding to the end of the 19th century. 600 metres walk from the Stadtmuseum is the Hessisches Landesmuseum, or the Hessian State Museum, the site of storage for many years of the City Museum's artefacts before its creation. The current museum building on Friedrichsplatz was inaugurated on August 23, 1913, to celebrate the millennium of the city of Kassel, and remarkably the building survived the Second World War with only minor damage, despite the rest of the city centre being almost completely destroyed. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War until the 1970s, when reconstruction works elsewhere in the city allowed for reorganisation of the museum's collection, the museum was pretty much the only exhibition space in the city and doubled up as the city's gallery. Part of the collection of the museum comes from works that Landgrave Karl had undertaken on burial mounds near Gundensberg, about 20 kilometres south of Kassel. All the discoveries from these works, along with the majority of all the archaeological finds from northern Hesse, now end up in the collection of the museum. Artefacts in the collection include items from the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods, around 800,000 years ago, through to the early Middle Ages, ending around the time that the city was founded, at which point local items are located in the Stadtmuseum. Much like the City Museum, the Landesmuseum was closed for major renovation works between 2008 and 2016, at which point the current galleries were laid out, including spaces created in what were previously courtyards. The museum has space to display around 6,000 objects from its collections at any one time, covering prehistory and early history, applied arts and folklore. The ground floor housing the historical collections arranged in chronological order, though I managed to go the wrong way, walking back through time from the early 900s to the dawn of man. The upper floors house the applied arts and folklore collections, including large amounts of religious art, as well as historical artefacts relating to daily life in northern Hesse throughout history. If the name of the street the museum is on, Frühstückspavillon, sounds a little familiar, then it'll be because of two of Kassel's most famous residents, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, aka the Brothers Grimm, the people most responsible for documentation and publishing of folklore and folktales, bringing, amongst others, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, the musicians of Bremen, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty and Snow White into global published literature. GRIMMWELT, or GRIMMWELT, located behind the Landesmuseum, opened in September 2015 to bring together the history and works of the two who came to live in Kassel in the autumn of 1798, when Jacob was 13 and Wilhelm was 12, having moved from Hanau. Whilst it's their collection of fairy tales and legends that the brothers are most famous for today, and takes up the majority of the space in the museum, they're also, along with other linguists and scholars, responsible for the first German dictionary, which they started in 1838. The brothers understood the daunting work ahead of them and had planned for the Deutsches Wörterbuch to be 6 or 7 volumes long and take 10 years of work. The first volume, A to Birkmölke, didn't appear for 14 years, and in the end Wilhelm only completed the letter D before his death in 1859, with Jacob managing to complete A, B, C and E before he died in 1863. He was working on Frucht, or fruit, at the time. In the end, the 32nd and final volume of the dictionary wasn't completed until 1961, 123 years after work started. To note, Samuel Johnson completed his English dictionary by himself in 9 years, just saying. The museum houses a large collection of artefacts by or related to the brothers, including first publications of many of their collections of folk tales, as well as photos, paintings, letters and more. It should be noted that fairy tales the brothers collected were as they were told at the time, and all have a much darker undertone than the literally Disneyfied versions that are common today. In fact, many of the original tales from the Grimm brothers are often described as grim, though sadly this is just serendipitous, the word grim existing in English long before the brothers' work came to the fore. The Wilhelmshöhe mountain park, or Bergpark Wilhelmshöhe, is located around 5 kilometres to the west of the centre of the city and is home to the Schloss Wilhelmshöhe, the palatial summer palace for Landgraves, constructed between 1786 and 1798 for Landgrave Wilhelm IX, who would go on to become Elector Wilhelm I, in part on the back of the money raised from selling mercenaries to the British Crown. The 2.4 square kilometre park, the largest mountain park in Europe, comprises a number of different buildings open to the public along the landscape park itself. These include the main palace, the Löwenberg or Lion Castle, and the Great Glasshouse or Große Gewächshaus. The greenhouse was built between 1822 and 23 under Elector Wilhelm II for the cultivation of exotic and valuable plants, one of the first glasshouses to be constructed on this scale in the world and considered groundbreaking in Germany. Originally, a lower domed section sat in the middle of a glass house, but this was replaced by a much more substantial palm house at some point in the latter part of the 19th century. Today, the palm house also includes a large bird cage that's home to a number of small songbirds. The palace is located in the lower part of the mountain park at an elevation of 282 metres above sea level, 115 metres higher than the centre of the city, of which it has commanding views of from the eastern-facing windows, with the Wilhelmshöhe Allee running on a direct axis from the palace to the city centre, and in the opposite direction, the axis continuing up the centre part of the mountain park towards the fountains, Neptune Basin, Grand Cascades, and at the highest point of the park, the statue of Hercules, some 515 metres above sea level and 233 metres above the palace. Located on the former site of the Reichenstein monastery of the Augustinian monks, Landgrave Moritz had a hunting lodge built here between 1606 and 1610, from which the palace was developed from. Laid out as a symmetrical three-wing structure with a main central wing facing east-west along the park axis, this wing is flanked by 2 slightly angled side wings, both connected to the central wing by a connecting passage, creating a semicircular ground plan. After the city palace burnt down in 1811, Jerome Bonaparte and his court moved to the palace full-time. Following the annexation of the electorate of Hesse-Kassel by Prussia, the palace passed into possession of the Hohenzollern family in 1866 and was in use as the summer residence of Kaiser Wilhelm II, right up until his abdication in 1918. The building was badly damaged during the bombing raids of February 1945. Repair works on the castle didn't start until 1961, lasting to 1974. With the completion of repair works, the palace now houses the antiquities and art collection of the Hessian State Museum. At the same time as the main palace building was being completed, work was started on the Löwenberg or Lion's Castle, a pleasure palace deliberately built as a partial ruin in the southern part of the mountain peak at 350 metres above sea level. The castle served as a private retreat for Wilhelm IX and, following his death in 1821, became his burial site. The building is considered groundbreaking, being one of the earliest examples of neo-Gothic architecture in Germany and one of the few pleasure palaces in this style. The castle is modelled after a hilltop fortress and is an imitation of a medieval knight's castle, albeit built centuries after such buildings had stopped being constructed in Germany. Originally, the Löwenberg was planned to be just a ruined tower with an outbuilding, but in the end a full castle complex was built around an inner courtyard. The castle was constructed using Harpichfall tuff, a stone that was readily available near the construction site, easy to work with, but not very weather resistant. The keep of the castle was largely destroyed in the Allied bombing raids of World War II, and other buildings in the complex were severely damaged. Reconstruction after the war was pragmatic, with functionality rather than attention to detail being the aim of the works. Between 2005 and 2022, a major renovation took place, with the keep being completely rebuilt and made accessible, undoing much for post-war functional repairs. Today, the castle grounds are open to be looked around, but access to the interior is only on one of the regular guided tours. Kassel Wilhelmshöhe is the most important station of the city, sitting on the high-speed lines from Hanover to Würzburg. The station sees regular ICE services from Berlin and Hamburg to Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Munich and Basel. There are regional express services, some that start at the Hauptbahnhof in the centre of town, that link to Dortmund, Essen and Düsseldorf, Halle and to Frankfurt. The small Kassel-Colden airport for northwest of the city only handles seasonal and charter flights, with the nearest major airport being Frankfurt. The busiest airport in Germany and main hub of Lufthansa, has connections across the globe.